is there any way to avoid death anxiety without appealing to consoling psychological ideologies such as religion or consumerism, etc.? Have you found a consistent answer for this in your work?
No, but we haven't looked, and so I think that's a high dollar question, and one that I think requires attention and is beginning to receive it. Again, not to sound defensive, but our original interest, again, going on 50 years ago, was to understand humankind's most unsavory affectation. So when Jeff and Tom and I met, our common interest was one of them was to understand prejudice and intolerance of folks who are different than us. And so we were immediately attracted to Becker's existential account, where he suggested that it's existential anxiety that drives our antipathy to people who are different. Because if you're different, then you subscribe to other beliefs. And if I accept your beliefs, then I'm undermining the confidence with which I adhere to my own. And so Becker is like that. So the natural reaction when we run into people who are different is to denigrate them, to dehumanize them, to try to get them to dispose of their ideas and accept ours instead. Or if that doesn't work, just to kill them. And that was literally what and so a lot of our early work, in fact, no, for 30 years or so, we're like, look, what our work suggests is that malignant manifestations of death anxiety, turn us into like hateful, warmongering, narcissistic serial killers plundering the planet, in an alcohol and Facebook, Twitter stupor. And very often people would say, well, yeah, all right, you've made me miserable, but besides, going to the back of the grocery store and drinking Woolite in the dumpster, what can we do about it? We what we noted, as you know, at the last chapter of The Worm at the Core, this again, it took the reason that the book was held up for a year, because the editor's like, well, you have to solve this problem of death anxiety. And we're like, that's not a soluble problem. The question is, how do we approach it?
Yeah.
And our point was, following Becker, is you're never going to get rid of death anxiety. It's not possible, nor is it even desirable. And you're not going to get rid of death, even if you could live forever. That wouldn't completely eliminate death anxiety. And then we're like, all right, well, that's what the religions and philosophers of the world have been doing since day one. So the Epic of Gilgamesh, upon which the Judeo-Christian tradition is based, is about not dying. Socrates says to philosophize is to learn how to die. And so there's been no shortage of attention to how to go about managing death anxiety. But to date, most of it has been, as you've suggested, James, it's been political ideology or religious fundamentalism. All right, no, recently there's been an intersection of terror management theory with what's called positive psychology on this end of the pond. And what some scholars have started to look at are awe, humility, and gratitude as ways to effectively manage death anxiety that do not have either advertent or inadvertent personal or social consequences. And so a student of Rollo May's, a famous existential therapist, a gentleman named Kirk Schneider, who's my age, writes extensively about awe. And the argument, and this goes back to the guy Emil Durkheim, who studied the origin of religion. It's obvious that part of religion is to help us deny death. It's equally obvious, though, that we don't just subscribe to religion because we deny death. We also love life. And Durkheim pointed out that one of his, somebody pointed out the original Latin word for religion, I don't remember what it is, and I don't speak Latin, means to bind. And it has nothing to do with being immortal, has nothing to do with gods. Durkheim just called it collective effervescence, the tremendously awesome and uplifting feeling that you get when you're in a social situation where you are momentarily engaged intellectually, emotionally, and intuitively with your fellow humans. For me, it would be like a Grateful Dead concert of yesteryear, where you're just undulating in time and momentarily de-individuated in the best sense of the word, because you are at that particular moment happily conjoined with your fellow humans. In other words, drumming and dancing may have been the first initial burst of collective effervescence that gives us just this sense that life is awesome. Well, anyway, the point that folks make is that when, and all of us, I hope, have had these just moments and of course, it goes beyond words. It is just, you are literally awed by all that is. And what people hypothesize and what has been established empirically is that awe leads to humility, which is not self-deprecation. It's just the realization that you are relatively inconsequential from a cosmic perspective. You're born, you're a respiring piece of carbon dust, born in a time of place not of your choosing, here for an infinitesimal amount of time in an unfathomably large universe that's benignly indifferent to your fate. Right now, that may seem devastating, but back to Otto Rank, if you see yourself as just a node that is intimately connected with this ginormous and ongoing cosmic enterprise, well, then that kind of humility is actually existentially fortifying. And there's work that suggests that when people are in a humble, which is not to be confused with self-deprecating state of mind, that reduces defensive reactions to death reminders. And then finally, humility leads to gratitude. And my point is that, all the world's great religions emphasize the virtues of gratitude. And for those of us that were lucky enough to have slept in a bed and had something to eat today, all of us, or many of us, actually not as many as need to be, but a lot of us in the so-called first world, we have a lot to be grateful for. Sure. And so my long-winded answer to a very fine question is that would be one approach, that psychological triumvirate of awe, humility, and gratitude. Other folks have, like Robert J. Lifton, a psychohistorian. In The Worm, we write about his views on symbolic immortality.
Yes, I love that. I love that part.
Me too. Not because we wrote it. I love it because the ideas are so compelling. And so you've got Lifton pointing out that we can be absorbed by our affection for nature, and that we can also broaden the scope of our attachment to and affection for other life forms and other entities. And so you have some folks saying, all right, next step is to acknowledge our commonality with all of our fellow humans. Tom Pazinski, my buddy, and his students have done a study where they do a common humanity prime. They tell people, you know, we're all more alike than we are different. All humans are like one big family. And as trite as that sounds, first of all, it happens to be true. But when you remind people that we're all one big tribe, and then you remind them of death, they don't hate people that are different because you just reminded them that we all have something in common. Well, other folks say, let's go, let's keep going. If we acknowledge our connection to all humans, how about all life? And now we're starting to get spiritual / mystical, but it's certainly not of recent vintage. And so since day one, have been cultural world views, including Native American ones that we're aware of over here, that emphasize the existential value of affection for all that lives. And we can even take that further. Martin Heidegger, in his later work, argued on behalf of the existential status of all things, that if we really want to adopt an ethical stance, and so you got Emmanuel Levinas, a philosopher, talking to us about how we as humans have obligations to fellow humans. Well, Heidegger says things have standing in their own right, be they rivers or rocks or poems. And then there's an Italian philosopher, Silvia Benso, who wrote a book called The Face of Things, where she juxtaposes Heidegger with Levinas. And she says if we're to avoid future genocidal and ecological disasters, then we need the most broad and ecumenical ethical stance that's possible. And that's to have the same respectful regard for everything as we do for everyone. And while that is a rather extreme and radical position, I'm finding it increasingly something worthy of serious cogitation, because it does, it just reframes the way that we look at the world and think of ourselves in it. And by the way, Benso's ideas square very nicely her notion of how it is that we should approach life, would embrace the notions of awe and humility and gratitude. She calls it festivity, and I find her ideas very compelling.
Yeah, and a lot of what you said actually segues into the next kind of question. Although you talked about immortality, in what you said there. Well, one thing that you said there, and it's interesting because immortality is sought after, but I think that's just sort of an illusion in some sense, because even if you're immortal, like you said, death anxiety, it's not that it wouldn't exist, but it would obviously be reduced, arguably. I don't know, but even if it was, and this is the thing, right? Even if it was, we'd still be left with life anxiety.
Absolutely.
So it's not like you can escape either way.